everyone. Hello, Kaya. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Seb. Thanks so much for having me. Hi, Eve.
Hi, Kaya. So happy to have you with us after, um, some exciting days that you've spent at the London Climate Action Week. And
Yeah,
we
it
thought,
was packed.
you're such a great person to dig a bit deeper on like what happened last week and what it actually means for different stakeholders and especially for the CDR community. So I was looking at what you wrote on social about the expectations, and you said that the Monday, the 22nd of June, was a day that you had been waiting forward for a year. Now we're having this conversation a week after. Was it what you expected? What's the takeaway?
Yeah. I mean, so just to give a bit of context, I guess myself and others who work on the net zero standards, the ISO net zero standard and the SBTi standard, for more than a year. I think it's been 3 years in the making that we've been kind of developing thinking through expert working groups, chewing over research, and feeding in and negotiating with one another about the ideal policy positions. And then, both standards launched at big events on the Monday, and there's this sort of sense of like relief, like now it's time to implement. Now it's time for the companies who have been waiting for this signal to start spending money on green markets.
Do you feel like, again, we've seen a lot of commentary on these two, right? They were both earlier than expected, and so we got to already see commentary, analyses, comparisons, and everything. I'm curious, what was the sentiment at London Climate Action Week when it comes to them?
I think that the sessions I was in, I attended probably 20 sessions or spoke at them on the standards. There's a real sense that there's a focus on action now. These are no longer about science-based target setting or measurement of emissions. That both standards are really focusing on implementation, and milestones from getting us from here to 2050. And I think that the key takeaway is that the standards have really listened to companies about where they're at and responded to challenges in a precise way. Whereas I think the previous net zero definitions were much more about ambition setting and aligning with Paris. And, of course, we still want to be aligned with common goals, but this focus on implementation comes out of both standards in really interesting ways.
The way you put it was that we now have a single global playbook. So was there anything that you saw in these conversations during London Climate Action Week that challenged that framing, or do you feel like this week reinforced it?
No, I mean, I think that the convergence messaging was really strong. Companies have been asking for this governance landscape to simplify for years, and one of the things that international standards do is that they reduce the noise on the market confusion. They create a sort of single source of truth, even though there is always more guidance that companies are going to need from consultants, from each other. The how can always go into detail, but that's where I want consultants and companies to play, not on the what, right? We need to have common and comparable and fair objectives that the market can achieve. And so I think having the measurement standards, you've got the ISO and GHGP accounting standards coming together in 2027. So that's one source of truth on how you measure your emissions in a comparable way. And you have the SBTi and ISO net zero target setting and transition planning standard that are the place you would go if you want to know how to set out a net zero line transition plan. And then you have your ISSB for financial reporting and GRI for impact reporting. That sounds like a lot of acronyms, but compared to like the 45 pieces of voluntary guidance that my team systematically reviewed just a couple of years ago, where every shop had their own definition of what net zero looks like. And honestly, they didn't vary too much. They all really copied each other. But now to be able to point companies towards, again, a single source of truth for measurement, target setting, and reporting, it's a really exciting opportunity to say, don't worry, guys, like we heard you. And here's your simplified outcomes. Now let me help you deliver.
But you say single source, but we're still talking, at least in the net zero transition plan and targets, still two, right? Like I see how they're complementary, ISO and SBTi,
Yeah.
but there's still two. And so how do you imagine a company like your company? You're currently not doing anything. You're looking at them. How would you recommend that they go about it then?
Well, hopefully my company is doing something already, even if we haven't signed up to a standard. And so I think that that actually helps me answer that question. So the ISO standard, being an international standard, is going to be able to reach different markets than SBTi might be able to. I guess I'll start by saying that they don't fundamentally contradict each other on the definition of net zero. We had teams working on ensuring technical interoperability across both. The reason that I jumped on the big ISO ship to help make sure it had a net zero standard, it was already planning to do so even when SBTIs had already come out, was because it's an international system that goes back to like the middle of the last century for international consensus. And in order to have, something that's a policy tool for people equally in Zimbabwe or Indonesia or Singapore or the UK, I felt that you needed a time-tested governance process. And sometimes the negotiations inside ISO feel a bit like the UN. Like you have UN negotiators coming in from the different governance standard bodies to have a conversation. And I think SBTi has done an absolutely amazing job of bringing in stakeholders from all around the world. But having that sort of dedicated governance system means that ISO could be a respected policy tool in places that SBTi might not be already reaching. I think both standards are really important tools, and I hope that any company that feels that they can't do SBTi for whatever reason can do ISO, and any company that feels that they can't do ISO for one reason will do SBTi. And I think that if I was advising a company, I would say have a look at both, because they do slightly different things. Their scope is slightly different. Like ISO is slightly wider, and SBTi is slightly more like, here's your short-term specific implementation that you need to be doing.
So given that both were having their big launch events on Monday, there was this whole week for the stakeholders to come together and digest and discuss and potentially challenge. You clearly were working on both already through your team, right? Was there anything on the feedback that you heard during that week that's managed to still surprise you?
Yeah. So I think that like one key distinction is to say that the ISO standard is still in draft. So we were looking for feedback. We still have 12 weeks to respond to the ISO consultation through public consults. That means anyone can respond through their national standards body. And so one of the things I was really feeling isn't finished about the ISO standard is the Scope 3 section. I think that what we tried to do in ISO was to get companies to focus primarily on their high magnitude, high influence emissions. So where they have, the largest potential impact and also the best ability to have, where they have the most leverage. And, but figuring out exactly how to do that. One of the differences between the two standards is that SBTi, you can go through and go activity by activity. And SBTi tells you what type of targets to set. Is it a supplier engagement target, or is it an intensity target, or is it an absolute reduction target? And they've really been able to think that through. I was on the Scope 3 working group of SBTi, and we were really looking at like individual cases at the activity level. Because ISO is supposed to be a little bit more of a generic policy tool, it doesn't go into that level of detail. So we have to be able to write the text in a kind of elegant, outcome-oriented way that gives companies a sense of, here's where we need to go. I'm going to figure out how to do it. So we can't write annex after annex or additional guidance the way that SBTi can, because they have this big technical staff and they can always be evolving and developing new tools. And so that's a place where I might say the ISO standard should point towards the SBTi if there's a need for additional guidance. But we still need to figure out how to write Scope 3 in a way that companies don't feel like they're swallowing the sea, but then captures enough of the high influence and high magnitude emissions.
Things in either standard that you, besides this one point that you just mentioned, that you weren't so thrilled about? Like, where do you see, for example, in the SBTi, still some potential weaknesses where if you'd been able to choose 2 years ago, you would have chosen something different?
I think one potential really, really big problem with SBTi right now, it comes really from a communication error at the moment, and I'm hoping that they're able to clarify this. Right now, it reads like a net zero standard there. You don't have to set a long-term net zero target. And that's because they merged the corporate target, which you can just set a reduction target, and the net zero standard. They had two standards. One was for short-term targets and one was for long-term targets. And they just merged them into one. Now, it made sense to merge them into one standard, but I really worry that you get companies into trouble from a claims perspective if they are validated with just a short-term target under a net zero standard and they start making that claim, but they don't have a long-term net zero target. And of course, the science shows us that we need to be doing backwards planning from a long-term target. Now, I know it'd be much more convenient for companies in terms of business cycles to just focus on the now. But if we just focus on the now and we don't plan for the future, we're going to get ourselves into a situation where the price shocks are huge for removals or the things you need to neutralize your residual emissions at 2045 or whenever your net zero target is. So I think that's created a huge risk for companies, both in terms of long-term safe financial planning and also in terms of potential claims. And I'm really concerned that that might have just been sort of a communications error that I'm hoping that they can clear up.
So what do you think would be like the most like obvious way to try and fix it?
I mean, I think you have to say, if you are registering yourself as a validated net zero standard aligned organization, you have to have a long-term net zero target. You can't use the term net zero anywhere in your claim if you don't have a long-term and credible net zero target with a plan for how you're going to deliver that, including how you're going to neutralize your residual emissions. And I think that ties into another area where I think that there was a cost-based decision rather than a science-based decision around not requiring removals earlier than 2035. It's very clear that we're going to have, both at a global level, a huge removals gap, and at a company level, a potential failure to plan if we don't start scaling up the removals that we expect to need for residual emissions. Now, the reason why I think that SBTi may have made that decision is that they're worried that companies are going to get scared away by the cost of removals. But that, to me, is even more a reason to start spreading out that cost over time by starting to purchase and do offtake agreements and scaling an industry that we want to see. I think Robert Hoagland and Claire Wigg put out a great paper, Create the world that your net zero target relies on. We need to start doing that planning now. And so I really think that neither from an economic science perspective nor from like a net zero science perspective is it a good call to not start buying removals earlier.
And we had Robert on the show to talk about SBTi, and he was very skeptical about this timeline. He was basically saying, who knows, what happens in the next 9 years? There could be further revisions, there could be further changes. And so 2035 feels really far out. And that actually leads me to one thing I want to talk about, which is this recognition framework that is before 2035, right? I have no idea how that's going to play out. Like, I think it's good because it allows companies that are doing something to at least be recognized for it. But my question is, will it actually lead to more companies doing anything that are not already doing it? So yeah, I'm curious, what's your take?
Yeah. So first, just to clarify, like one of the only differences in terms of like, near-term action between ISO and SBTi, one of the key differences is that ISO does require 5-year milestones. So once you've got your target in place, you need to be setting removals milestones for how much you're removing every 5 years. So that's earlier than 2035. So we have that in there. I think, both standards have this recognition of of taking responsibility for your ongoing or your remaining emissions. So that is a well-researched piece of work from SBTi. It was more looked at in terms of how do we incentivize investment beyond the value chain. This was when we were thinking less about removals and more about the sort of everything else of high-quality contributions to global net zero. And the challenge from the market, especially the kind of carbon market, was there's no reason for companies to do this. It looks like philanthropy when you frame it as BBCM. And so then SBTi commissioned some research as to how do we incentivize companies to take some responsibility for their ongoing emissions, whether that be through purchasing removals, whether that be through high quality avoided emissions credits, if they're not claiming these as offsets or using them to cancel out their emissions. And what they found from that research was that you have to require a minimum. So that's what they've sort of done, is like required, like, you take responsibility for 1% of your ongoing emissions, or you get leaderboards. And then the second piece of research, or the second finding from that research, was that if you create a leaderboard, you create competition. And then I had a master's student do, interviews and surveys of the market, and those were the two policy interventions that people thought would help. So it's not the silver bullet, but I think it will be really interesting to see if we can gamify it a bit, and start to see companies being able to, for the first time, being able to show off, like, I'm doing much more than my competitor on this, and we have similar capacity. But the reason why it's been hard to compare is that companies have such different contexts and capacities.
Yeah. So do you think now with this clarity that the standard brings, that it's going to be much easier to compare?
Yeah. I mean, if you have a leaderboard and it's like, you're comparing Tesco and Sainsbury's about how much of their, ongoing emissions they're taking responsibility for, and multiplying by that by what carbon fee. And you've got one taking responsibility for 1% and the other taking responsibility for 10%, and multiplying that by a much harder carbon fee. Like, that's going to be, it's going to start to look bad for a comparable competitor. Where I think we probably need to do some innovating still is that we probably need to be weighting these by sector. So by sector or by context. So you can't really compare the ability of Microsoft to pay for CDR to the ability of of Tesco, right? This is not comparable. Like the different or a high margin versus a low margin industry. And so we probably need to be figuring out some weighting scores to say proportional to what capacity you have, or what revenue you have. So I think there's going to be fun ways to play. But then again, of course, companies are always going to find whatever you do to compare them, they're always going to find it unfair, because it's impossible to make a rating system that is truly representative of context. And yet that conversation will hopefully in itself drive more focus on the market and more focus on the topic, which can't be a bad thing.
Yeah. Now, I'm thinking so we have the SBTi standards. There's still some elements to come to clarify it further later on, but the bulk is there. ISO is in the process of consultation, and eventually we'll also have the final standard. But I think the draft very clearly already indicates the direction of travel. So we have clearer picture when it comes to standards than we've ever had before in this sense. So what's your take? Where does the hard work shift now when it comes to corporates, or also potentially the governance and standards? What do you see as next possible bottlenecks that are gonna be maybe the top of conversation next year at the London Climate Action Week?
I think that the next big conversation is the governance around commodity certificates, and understanding. So both standards are welcoming the use of market mechanisms in situations where companies are not able to directly influence their value chain. And those commodities markets are going to have hopefully a big boom from the 11,000 companies signed up to SBTi, and then the sort of signal that ISO sends for those who are looking at ISO. And so my concern with those commodity certificates is that first of all, let's just celebrate that for a moment. Like, if we can use the voluntary system that we've created to open up pathways for green steel, green cement, really credible SAF industry, areas where we clearly have, or trucking, like there's just so many, I think, startups that some of whom I've talked to who are just waiting for this signal, because companies are like, oh, we're not gonna buy that stuff until we know it counts. And now both standards have very kind of clearly said, no, guys, this counts. Not only that, but you're encouraged to. You still have to follow a little bit of a hierarchy where you focus on yourself as a resource priority. But when you really have shown that you've tried what you can, go ahead and buy those certificates. My concern with those certificates is that they become really sector-specific governance. And when you have really specific, like industry-specific governance, it becomes harder for independent actors like myself, academia, or NGOs to weigh in on that process, and they can very easily be gained. So there's concerns about, particularly in sectors where mass balance is going to be a part of the picture. How do we avoid the kind of additionality crisis that we saw across other areas of the carbon market, RECs, other avoided emissions credits, where it's really hard to say, like, whether a certificate that was being purchased is a credible, does relate to a credible reduction, and a not double counted reduction. So I think that there's going to be a lot of talk about product level standards and commodity certificate governance at the next London Climate Action Week.
Interesting. And as you said, the ISO 1 is in draft right now, and the SBTi, to say the least, changed quite a lot between different drafts. For those who are less familiar with the process, how do you see the ISO within that? Like, can we expect 180s? Is it kind of, are the broad boundaries kind of set? How should folks interpret it?
You would not expect a 180 in an ISO process, because the process is built on a degree of consensus, which is not quite UN level consensus. Like, it doesn't mean that like no one objects. It means that there's the lack of sustained opposition, the lack of sustained and deep opposition. So we've gotten this far through the sort of delegates that have come through the different national standard bodies. And what will be looked at is when there's like a preponderance of comments from the public through those national standards bodies on a key topic. So I suspect that like at a high level, the principles and the outcomes that are across key decisions are unlikely to be like completely reversed. What you might see is more flexibility in areas where something was maybe written in a little bit too rigid of a way, because we actually get a much wider sense of the user feedback. So I'm expecting more flexibility to come in on scope 3, because I honestly don't know if we've finished that section. We still need more user feedback on like how are companies actually setting scope 3 targets. Maybe the removals industry will comment on the removals section and say like, you need to define these milestones more. So I think it's really about taking the scaffolding that has been built and then improving it, refining it, developing it. That said, if there is sustained and deep opposition on something, it could be that there's a reversal. I think that like if we take the international and public feedback very seriously, but I think that would have to be on, just for the sake of time and the fact that we have until the end of the year to finish this standard, that would only be on a few things necessarily, because we have these ISO meetings where we meet for like 8-10 hours a day. And then that's our time for the month. And maybe we have a chance to do a few more of those throughout the end of the year. We couldn't do a 180 on everything in a few months. The standard would probably not go through. We would exceed our deadline for finishing the standard. So you can't expect too many 180s, and you shouldn't. And that wouldn't be kind of good, policy making process to expect that, because you want to build on what you've developed previously. But if there is something that people feel really passionately about, that becomes a hotspot.
Mm-hmm. I see. So the process sets some constraints by itself, basically.
Time constraints.
Exactly.
As long as we can argue it out, we can do it. But there is a limit. We want to get this to the market so it can be used.
Sebastian, do you want to cover more on the standards? Because my next question is more broader than that. So
I guess I have one more question on ISO before we go maybe broader, which is the application of it. You mentioned kind of companies deciding to follow one or the other because they kind of cater to different, I guess, potential of the company. But there's obviously the whole government angle that is quite interesting with ISO. And so I wanted to ask you, like, how do you see this potentially being used and by whom in the next couple of
Yeah.
years?
Yeah, I mean, so the ISO system is sort of WTO recognized. Like, so it is, ISO standards are favored tools for trade because, understandably, you want to be developing trade policy that is applicable to international contexts, both the receiver of the trade policy and the sort of actor that's demanding a standard be used. And so it's when you have an international standard that has been developed with the true perspectives of different countries in mind, then that's a sort of favored trade tool. I think that I could see the ISO net zero standard, or really any net zero standard, but the ISO one in particular, being a good policy tool for a couple of key policy domains. So I think it is the answer to the questions that disclosure has asked. So I think as a reminder about what, like, we've all celebrated, and we need to continue to defend high integrity disclosure laws all around the world. And we see ISSB has been adopted in over 40 jurisdictions. But as a reminder of what disclosure is, it's posing the question, are you prepared for the future? Are you going to be net zero aligned? That doesn't create a normative or fair or comparable requirement about whether companies actually are. And so the net zero standard helps respond to that question that disclosure standards helped to pose. So it's the next phase of sort of ratcheting of global regulation. And I see the potential for the ISO net zero standard in the kind of markets where we've seen more ambitious disclosure law, more ambitious than the EU or the UK. Like, I think Africa and Asia, they see people who are, like, thinking about how can I make my country more investable, are like, well, these standards are a really good way to do that. And so I think we're going to see uptake in, really like trade dependent areas. And then the other really key policy domain that I see that could be used is green public procurement, the sort of who of green public procurement. Governments saying, like, that, that's great. We're going to put a big tender out, but we want the companies that bid to be net zero aligned, because that's the fastest way to sort of scale the alignment of our real economy with our NDC. And then I think claims legislation is the other obvious domain.
So you've been to many London Climate Action Weeks, I'm sure. So you have a good before and after sense. So what's your impression? How is this energy level this year compared to previous year? If you look at the policymakers, companies, we are obviously looking also different CDR stakeholders, buyers, and so on. What stood out to you in general?
I think that the most inciting conversations that I was in were about how we're evolving with these challenges. I spent more time this year in closed roundtables with 40 experts who are like the leading experts around the world on, this technical area of net zero policy, or this technical area of trade or industrialization. And I think that those conversations really gave me hope, because people are like, I'm seeing that there's a problem event over here because of the geopolitics of today, but actually that's creating an opportunity. So the energy security issue is creating an opportunity for renewables, or the AI boom is creating an opportunity, again, for renewables, or the net zero targets issue, where a lot of companies are staring down 2030 deadlines that they might not make. That's giving us new ways to think about how we focus on the action that we want them to take. In the case that they maybe miss a target that may or may not have been set with, like, an understandable baseline. And so really, really helping us to evolve with the times, and use this as an opportunity to get more of what we want. Oh, you're going to miss your target? Show us some action that you're doing to support the enabling environment. Oh, you're worried about energy security? Great. Show us what you're building in terms of renewables.
It's very exciting. Excellent. I think we've come to a good close, right? We've covered a lot
Yeah.
of ground. So I would say let's wrap it up here, unless ever you have another burning question.
I don't think we got a lot of details from you, Kaya, today. It's unbelievable what one can pack into 30 minutes.
Thank
Really.
you.
I agree.
Sometimes my team tells me I speak too fast, so
I like it.
thanks for entertaining me.
Yeah, thanks
Thank
so
you,
much,
Kaya.
Kaya.
Thanks so much. Have a good
Yeah.
rest of your day.
Cheers.
Bye.